Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving into something pretty significant. Reports about a planned Israeli military strike against Iran's nuclear facilities specifically.
Yeah, and what makes it really compelling is this twist where apparently U.S. President Donald Trump stepped in, halted the whole thing, pushing for diplomatic talks instead.
It's a fascinating mix, isn't it? Military gears turning, and then suddenly high-stakes diplomacy takes center stage.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, we're pulling from a few key places. Ynet News, Middle East Eye, and Jewish Insider, which actually leans on some New York Times reporting too. So quite a bit to work with here.
Yeah, good sources. Our aim really is to unpack this whole situation. We want to get into the details of what Israel was planning, why President Trump made the call he did.
Explore those internal debates, within the U.S. administration, because it sounds like it wasn't a simple decision.
Exactly. And then look at the fallout, the implications for the region, for the nuclear talks going forward.
Right. We know following these kinds of international security issues, potential military moves, it can get complicated fast. So we'll try and boil it down, provide some clarity on this specific, pretty intense moment.
Okay, let's jump right in. This planned Israeli strike, it wasn't just talk, was it? Reports suggest they were looking at May, possibly.
That's what the reporting indicates, yeah. The New York Times piece suggested the main goal was clear: set back Iran's nuclear program significantly. They were hoping for at least a year's delay.
And the first idea wasn't just like dropping bombs, it was more involved.
Much more. Sources mentioned combo airstrikes, yes, but also commando raids, targeting those tricky underground nuclear sites. A bit like that reported Israeli op in Syria a while back.
Wow. Okay, and for that kind of operation, the complex one?
That's where the U.S. dependency really comes into focus. The initial thinking, reportedly, was that Israel would need serious American backup. We're talking things like U.S. cover fire for Israeli ground troops, broader defense. Essentially, the U.S. would be quite involved, not just watching from the sidelines.
But that plan, the commando raid one, hit a snag. Timeline issues.
Exactly. It seems Israeli military folks told their U.S. counterparts, look, this complex op, it's going to take months to prep. We're not looking at readiness before October, maybe even later.
So that May timeline was out for the big plan.
Which likely explains the shift. They pivoted to something potentially quicker, maybe less decisive, but doable sooner.
Which was this broader air campaign idea, something they could maybe get going by May.
Right. Potentially lasting over a week, the reports say. But crucially...
Still needed U.S. help.
Yes, that requirement didn't just vanish. A major part of this plan involved taking out Iran's air defenses. Think those Russian S-300 systems. And it's worth remembering, some reports suggested Israel had already damaged some of those in a prior strike, so they knew it was tough.
So Israel's cooking up these plans, first complex, then air-focused. What was the vibe in D.C.? I mean, they weren't just waiting for Israel to say go, right?
Oh, definitely not. The U.S. side was, well, complicated. Initially, you had some figures who seemed, let's say, open to listening. CENTCOM Commander General Kurilla and the National Security Advisor Mike Waltz reports suggest they were seriously considering the Israeli proposals. They were even exploring how the U.S. could potentially support it if Trump gave the okay.
And that lines up with seeing some major U.S. military hardware moving into the area around then, doesn't it?
It does. You saw the USS Carl Vinson carrier steaming into the Persian Gulf. The USS Harry Truman was already in the Red Sea.
Big presence.
Huge. Plus, 2 Patriot missile batteries and a THAAD system that's top-tier missile defense moved into Israel itself.
And the bombers.
6 B-2 stealth bombers saluted Diego Garcia. These are the planes designed to get past sophisticated defenses. And there was even talk maybe putting more U.S. fighter jets in the region, maybe even on Israeli bases.
Okay, so publicly, some of that might have been framed around, say, the Houthi situation in Yemen.
Right, that was often the public line. But sources we're looking at indicate U.S. officials privately admitted, yeah, this is also about contingency planning for Iran. Basically, having assets in place if an Israeli strike happened. Even if U.S. planes didn't fire the first shot, their presence could deter a massive Iranian response.
But even with all that hardware moving and some initial openness, something changed in the White House. The mood shifted.
It seems so. Because ultimately, President Trump pulled the plug on backing the strike. He opted for diplomacy instead, trying to start direct talks with Iran. And this wasn't a snap decision, according to the New York Times reporting. It followed months of pretty intense internal debate, real division within the administration.
So not everyone was on board with supporting a strike.
Far from it. You basically had 2 opposing camps. On one side, people like General Kurilla and Mike Waltz, at least initially, who seemed more aligned with Israel's thinking. But then you had a strong countercurrent. People were really worried about the U.S. getting sucked into a huge regional war.
And who were the main voices pushing back against the military option?
Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard was key. She apparently presented intel assessments warning that the U.S. military buildup itself was increasing the risk of a wider conflict. Others raising red flags included Chief of Staff Susie Wiles, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth, and significantly, Vice President J.D. Vance.
What was their main argument? Just war is bad, or more specific concerns?
Pretty specific. The big one was the risk of escalation. A strike could easily spiral, draw the U.S. directly into fighting Iran, something both U.S. and Israeli officials apparently acknowledged was a real danger.
Okay, that makes sense.
Plus, there was this counterintuitive worry. Hitting Iran might actually backfire. It could push Tehran to say, okay, that's it, we need the bomb for security. And interestingly, even Waltz, who was initially open, reportedly became more doubtful. Doubted the strike could really work without massive, direct U.S. involvement.
So what was the argument for diplomacy then? Why pivot to talks?
Vice President Vance seems to have been a strong proponent here. The argument, reportedly, was that Trump had a unique chance. Iran was seen as relatively weak at that moment, militarily, economically. Maybe, just maybe, this was the time for a historic diplomatic deal. The thinking was, try talks first. If they fail, okay, maybe revisit the military stuff, but give diplomacy a real shot.
Which brings us to Netanyahu's visit to the White House. It sounded quite rushed.
Yeah, the timing suggests urgency. Reports indicate his main goal was exactly that. Try one last time to convince Trump to okay the attack.
Even though the public reason given was tariffs or something.
Right. Publicly, it was framed around trade issues, potential new tariffs. But behind closed doors, for Israel, the sources say it was all about the strike plan.
But Trump had already kind of made up his mind.
Seems that way. During that joint Oval Office appearance, Trump actually announced the start of direct negotiations with Iran. Big signal. And privately, he apparently told Netanyahu straight up, if these talks move forward, I'm not backing an Israeli strike in May. Then the next day, Trump added publicly that, if a military solution was needed down the line, Israel would lead it, kind of putting the ball back in Israel's court, but without U.S. backing for an imminent strike.
Okay, so the focus shifts fully to diplomacy. How did those efforts actually start to take shape?
Well, Trump announced direct talks were starting. But it's interesting, there was an earlier move in March. The U.S. had apparently proposed indirect talks. At first, Iran's Supreme Leader Khamenei seemed to shoot it down, but then later in March, another Iranian official signaled, okay, maybe we are willing to do indirect talks.
So some signals crossing, maybe some confusion there. And did actual meetings happen?
Yes. We know U.S. and Iranian diplomats did meet for discussions in Oman, and there were plans for more talks, possibly in Italy.
What was Iran saying publicly?
Their line was they wanted a fair agreement. But they were still refusing direct face-to-face talks with the U.S. A lot of that suspicion goes back to Trump pulling the U.S. out of the original nuclear deal, the JCPOA, back in 2018. Trust was low.
And even inside Trump's team, they weren't sure what kind of deal Iran would even consider.
Exactly. The reports mentioned internal debate in the U.S. admin about what Iran might realistically accept. What concessions would they need? How much would they limit their program? So even the side pushing for diplomacy wasn't entirely sure what success would look like or how likely it was. That definitely complicated things.
Right. So let's flip back to Israel's perspective then. How are they seeing this whole situation unfold with the strike called off? What are they thinking next?
Well, there seems to be a general understanding in their security circles that, look, if Israel did strike alone, it would almost certainly provoke a big Iranian reaction. And that, in turn, would likely pull the U.S. into the fight anyway. So the risks of going it alone were very high.
But does that mean they just accept the situation?
Not necessarily. You have voices like Michael Makovsky from GINSA arguing that Israel might have to strike Iran's nuclear sites in the coming months, basically saying with or without U.S. support, it might become unavoidable from their perspective.
That definitely points to potential friction down the road between the U.S. and Israel.
For sure. And Mark Dubowitz from FTD adds another layer. He argues you need a credible military threat on the table to make diplomacy work. His point is, if you signal military action is off limits, you weaken your own negotiating hand with Iran.
And we saw some political reactions in the U.S. too, right? People weren't happy about the decision or the leaks.
Yeah, Representative Jared Moskowitz was quite critical. He pointed out what he saw as a double standard, suggesting if a Democrat president had done this, Republicans would be outraged. His stance was basically, No deal with Iran until their nuclear program is gone, period.
Any other notable reactions?
Former Ambassador Daniel Shapiro also weighed in. He seemed pretty pessimistic about the chances of diplomatic success. And he actually argued the U.S. and Israel should be talking strike plans right now, given those low odds.
And all this is happening while U.S. intelligence is warning about the risks already present.
Exactly. The intel community was reportedly cautioning that just having all those U.S. forces concentrated in the region was risky. It increased the chances of miscalculation, of stumbling into a wider conflict with Iran, basically confirming the fears of those who argued against the strike. It underscored how easily things could spiral.
So where does that leave things now? Diplomacy is the main track, but the military option isn't totally gone.
That seems to be the picture. After Netanyahu's visit, CIA Director John Ratcliffe went to Israel, met with Netanyahu, met with the Mossad chief, David Barnea, and reports suggest a whole range of options are still being discussed between the U.S. and Israel. It's not just diplomacy or all-out strike.
It's quite.
Things like joint covert operations, maybe heating the program that way,
Yeah.
or getting much tougher on enforcing economic sanctions. So, yeah, the big strike might be paused, but other forms of pressure, other actions, seem very much still on the table.
Okay, let's try and pull this all together then. We started with this reported Israeli plan for a significant strike on Iran's nuclear program, possibly aiming for May.
Right. The U.S., under Trump, initially looked somewhat open to it, even moved major military assets into position.
But then internal debates, driven mainly by fears of a wider war and maybe a sliver of hope for diplomacy,
led Trump to nix the military plan and push for direct talks with Iran instead.
Those talks are happening or trying to happen, but there's still a lot of tension and different ideas in both Washington and Jerusalem about the best path forward.
Absolutely. It really highlights that core dilemma in dealing with nuclear ambitions. Everyone wants to stop Iran getting the bomb, but there's this huge split on how the risks of military action versus the uncertainties of diplomacy. It's a classic high-stakes geopolitical balancing act.
Yeah, incredibly complex. So something for everyone listening to this deep dive to think about. That balance. Military readiness on one side, some say it's essential leverage, diplomatic openings on the other, a potential path away from conflict, but maybe uncertain. In situations like this, what factors do you think ultimately tip the scales? What makes one approach succeed where another might fail when dealing with something as complex as nuclear proliferation? Definitely something worth mulling over. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.